So bonjour, comment ça va, everybody? We've got Caeli McKay, who just informed me that while she doesn't speak French, she understands it. So I figured I'd throw out a little bit at you to see if you understood what I was saying. So hello, how's everybody doing? We've got Caeli, you're a Canadian Olympian as a 10-meter diver. You were initially born in Calgary, Alberta. Now you live in Montreal, Quebec, which, by the way, is my favorite city in the whole world. Even though I've traveled all over the world in a lot of different capacities, Montreal to me is just so beautiful. It's so unique. It's so special. So I'm a big, big fan. In 2019, you took silver in the Pan American Games, bronze in the 2021 World Cup as an individual, but you're also in a synchro diving at 2018 Commonwealth Games, 2019 Pan American Games, the World Series, and the 2021 FINA World Cup. Outside of diving, right? It's interesting because you spend a lot of time, I imagine, indoors, but really you also verbalize that a lot of your passion is mountain biking, hiking, snowboarding, fly fishing, and being outdoors. And you're also an advocate for mental health, chronic pain, and eating disorders, all of which have personally impacted you and you've personally had experience with. So I'm super excited to have you on as an athlete, as an advocate, as somebody that sort of lives these experiences and is willing to share about them. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about all this.
I think it's going to be an awesome episode and an awesome conversation. So here's where I want to start, right? I'm always interested in how people get into their sport. And I know you started as a gymnast and then ultimately got into diving, but still at a pretty early age. So can you talk a little bit about your exposure to diving and what really drew you to the sport?
Well, growing up, my parents specifically were very into the adrenaline rush and, kind of it was a little bit of a thing that was, in my blood. So growing up, I was always on my mountain bike. I was always outside with my parents. We were camping, and gymnastics was a good vessel for me to express my energy. I mean, like I got kicked out of my ballet class like 100 times because I had way too much energy and I was doing things I shouldn't have. So gymnastics was a good like vessel for me to express myself. But I was a very competitive person. And I was 5 years old and I wanted to compete, and I wasn't allowed to compete because I was too young. So and with gymnastics, they obviously have to have rules. So I couldn't do flips when I wanted to do flips, and I couldn't just throw myself everywhere. So my parents realized that there was a diving summer camp going on at our city pool, and signed me up for that camp. And I had the best time of my life, but also the coaches saw potential in me and were kind of scouting for talent at the same time. So with that, my parents got an email, or I think a phone call, something like that, saying like your daughter has potential and we'd like to have her on our team. And from there, I kind of just switched over from gymnastics to diving and started competing provincially soon after, within the next year. And then from then was just a diver.
When you say you had like the best time of your life, tell me like what was it that like really excited you or that like you had so much enjoyment for? Like what was it?
It was so new. I love the water as well, the adrenaline, the mix with the adrenaline, and just like the freedom of being able to literally like throw yourself off of a board. It was very fun and exhilarating. And when you're a child, like you don't have that fear you don't really have that concept of fear and understanding like what you're doing is dangerous. So I think for me, with diving, like rather than gymnastics where everyone's saying don't do that, don't do that, you can't do that, you can't, like, because they don't want you to land on your head on the trampoline, whereas in diving you're just jumping off a 1 meter board at that age, right? So they're allowing you to do things that really let you express yourself and like get that energy out. And obviously I did hurt myself a lot when I was little, but I learned from it and it's part of the process. So just that whole, the first like 2 years of my like diving career when I was like 5 to 7 were just a lot of like learning, and really like I was allowed to compete. So it was nice for me to be able to like be good at something and learn at the same time, and enjoy it. Whereas like with some other things in my life when I was learning, I wasn't quite enjoying it. So um I think that's kind of where it all started and really just picked up from there.
And this is interesting to me because I think, obviously part of what I do is working with elite athletes, but I'm also a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So as far as like development and growth, you brought up a really good point that as kids, oftentimes adults in their lives are telling them what not to do in order to keep them safe, right? And so they become really, really restricted. But the way to really grow and learn is to experience things. And you talked about this idea of freedom, right? Like at an early age, to have freedom to throw yourself off a board in the water, which is, again, relatively safe, all things being equal, if you know how to swim and you have kind of the protective stuff. But this idea of really being able to, like, how many 5 to 7 year olds are able to express themselves creatively, throw themselves in the air, be able to experience what it's like to have that and, be able to navigate that. And that creates a sense of excitement. It creates a sense of adrenaline. Those things then reinforce, like, let me do it again. Let me do it again. I want it again. I want again. I can only imagine,
Mhm.
you throwing yourself off the board in the water and then running right out to be like, again, again. And like, how exciting that is. The other thing I think is interesting, and I read this about you, is that you had a moment where you watched an Olympic diver, right? And you turned to your parents and said, that's what I want to do. So can you also talk about that moment and kind of how that shaped your experiences and kind of that, I guess, determination or motivation to say, like, I want to do this?
Yeah, so it wasn't diving specifically. I think we were actually watching like the Winter Olympics. Um, it was either 2004 Olympics or 2006. Um, but I remember them having Olympic medals that were looked like a donut. Okay. So that I think that was 2006. But so we were watching the Olympics and whatever event we were watching, like we always watched as a family, and it's something that like we did every Olympics, winter or summer. So it became kind of a tradition. And when I was capable enough to understand what was going on, I just turned to my parents and said, I want to be an Olympian. I want to go there. I want to do that. So from there, when I started diving and competing, I kind of had that in mind. And I remember my first provincial competition when I won a medal, I cried when I got my medal because it didn't look like a donut. So like that whole motivation came from, those few moments. But, even being like 4 years old, I was with my grandfather, and like diving had always been around, like you're at the pool, the summer pool, you're just playing around. My grandpa dared me when I was like 4 years old to go do a flip for $5, and I did it. So it's like, it's always kind of been embedded in me even before I did that summer camp, and just that competitive spirit to like really want to succeed for myself. But the Olympics was always in the back of my mind, and always the motivating factor of like, yeah, okay, maybe at this point I'm training really hard to win nationals, but in the end I'm training to win nationals, to win worlds, to be able to go to the Olympics.
I think it's awesome too. Like there's this concept of how our brains process time and, and how we process it more in terms of experiences, and experiences that have some sort of emotional meaning, positive or negative, kind of tend to like reinforce, right? So you've talked about a couple of like really brief moments that like in your mind really kind of solidified and had an impact, right? Watching the Olympics, seeing these medals that look like donuts and saying, I want one of those, getting bet $5 to do a flip. Like even as you bring these things up, chronologically in all your training process in all your life, these probably took up very little bit of time, but they become so meaningful in terms of shaping what you do and how you navigate that. And I think it's just so interesting, again, how these experiences in our childhood can really shape us, and they're so meaningful and they're so impactful. Now, you also then, at the age of 16, you moved to Montreal without your family. So can you talk about that experience, some of the challenges that came with that, and ultimately sort of that, again, how that kind of molded you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Calgary all the way up to 16, and I was relatively successful in my junior career. Around that age, like 15, 16, I started becoming more competitive on the senior level. And 2016 was Rio Olympic year. So it was kind of when some of the athletes were going to retire, and we were going to have a bit of new people coming into the Olympic team and all that. So I was scouted by Diving Canada to become the new synchro partner for who ended up being my partner, Megan Benfado. Um, and also, like, there was a little incident where her partner at that time broke her foot about 7 or 8 months before the Olympic, maybe 6 months before the Olympics. So at that point, they were kind of like thinking last case scenario, worst case scenario, Caeli will fill in with Megan, if anything, like if Rosalind couldn't compete. So that was the basis of it. But at 16, they invited me to come to Montreal for around 5 weeks. And I packed my bags. I came back up here and lived with Megan for that 5 weeks, which extended into 3 months, which extended into 5 months, which extended then into what it's been 7 years now. So like moving at 16, I wasn't really expecting to move fully. I was actually thinking I was going to be coming for 5 weeks, going home for 3, do a little back and forth, which didn't really end up happening because I saw potential in myself. I think they saw potential in me as an athlete, the way that I trained at the Olympic Stadium here in Montreal with the team. It was very immersive. I showed up to the pool and it was the whole Olympic team, it was just completely surreal because Calgary, we had one, maybe two Olympians that I had trained with at a few points in my life, and only one when I was growing up. So being immersed in this Olympic environment, like with everybody that's been to the Olympics, it was I was very starstruck. And especially with the synchro partner that I was training with, she's a 3-time Olympic medalist, and like it was just incredibly surreal for me. So it was a little bit overwhelming, and I felt slightly unprepared. They kind of, I got there, they tried to prepare me as much as I could, but we tore down all of my technique to try and rebuild, to be, matching with my partner and to kind of break down those bad habits within my diving technique. So it was a lot of new things. It was a lot of scary things. I did have moments where I felt quite alone, and I had been surrounded by my family, obviously, for the first 16 years of my life every day, but I was quite independent from around 14 or 15 since I was diving very intensely. But moving here was a huge change in my life just because like it was a completely new atmosphere. Calgary and Montreal, first of all, are very different cities, very different cultures, very different people. And my lifestyle completely changed. It changed from, being able to go out to my cottage every weekend and, let all my heebie-jeebies out with like mountain biking and hiking and kind of separating myself to being in Montreal in the city here for diving and kind of only for diving. And, I was still in high school at that point. So I ended up doing online schooling from Alberta in Montreal, which took me 4 extra years. Like I graduated high school when I was 20 because of how much I was training and how hard it was for me to balance. And this was pre-COVID too. So online school was a little bit different, a little bit harder to navigate. So, there are a lot of challenges. And within the first year of me being here, I got thrown into the World Series circuit, which is top 8 in the world get invited to this circuit where you compete on 3 to 5 legs of competition. So me having not competed very much on the senior circuit, I had done a few Grand Prix, which compared to the World Series were nothing. It was a very big wake-up call, and I was diving with Olympic champions that I had only seen on TV. So it was a lot to learn in a very short amount of time. It shaped me as an athlete, which I'm thankful for, but it was quite a struggle for the first few years that I was here.
And was there any sort of, for lack of a better term, support as far as taking a young person, right? I mean, as an athlete, it's one thing, right? So you're identified as an athlete, you're there, you're given training partners, training facilities, you're surrounded by all these amazing people, coaches, and they're breaking down. But at the same time, like you're a young person who's sort of at an age where you're really starting to separate out, individuate out kind of who you are, what your identity is, as an athlete, as an individual. And that's like a pretty critical time in development, right? Where you're kind of navigating that and you turn to your friends or the people that you know outside of your family. And now you're essentially taken away from all that. So was there anything that was sort of identified or kind of provided any framework or support for that? Or was that something that you really kind of had to figure out on your own? Because again, your purpose there was to be there for diving.
Yeah, so honestly, I was kind of like a guinea pig with this whole situation. There wasn't many people at that age that had moved away completely and like really just picked up and left and changed cities by themselves. There was a lot of resources with like a mental prep, And, within the community, there wasn't much to kind of help me feel super comfortable. Like I did move in with my synchro partner, Megan, for 5 weeks because I knew her, and they wanted us to build some chemistry, and we got very close, and she became kind of like a sister. So like that was a really helpful support system. So I did have kind of like a family atmosphere around me, Megan's family, which was very, very nice and quite helpful. Because if I was by myself, it would have been like very like a lot. It would have been a lot on me. So I was able to express myself with them, but it still was very hard because no one could understand really, and no one could, really feel what I was feeling and understand how hard it was for me to be away from my family. Like I left my brothers, one was 7 or 6. I think he was 7, and the other one was 11. And I look back on it now, and like I realized as I was here when I was 16 and 17 and 18, I was like, I'm missing my brothers grow up. So like that was a whole other thing that, some people don't really think about. They're like, oh, well, you're on the Olympic team, you're following your dreams, you're traveling the world. And there's also this like, there's like, yeah, that's great. But like, there's like a whole part of my life that I wasn't able to experience anymore, which was very hard to just accept really. So there wasn't much. I've been, if someone comes here, I've actually had an experience where an athlete moved from Toronto here without her family at 17, and I immediately was like, I'm going to be there for her. Like I want to be there for her, and she's my best friend now. So like it's through bad experience or hard experiences, I've learned a lot, and hopefully I'm able to help other people with similar experiences. And I've seen that with my best friend now that, I helped her, and now she's helping me too, because we've experienced something in the same, and just being able to relate on that level is very nice.
I think it's such an important point, and that's where I think that, like you said, a lot of people don't get it and understand it because it's hard. I mean, you wouldn't understand it if you haven't experienced that. And it's easy to kind of look at, you know, wow, what a great opportunity, and look at all the cool things you're doing. You're traveling around the world, and you're surrounded by all these people, and you're working with a 3-time Olympic medalist. And yeah, that's all true, but you're still a young person who's now missing birthdays and holidays and experiences and trying to kind of navigate that from a distance. I mean, it's not like you said, it's not a 5-week summer camp. I mean, it turns into years and years, and that really kind of shapes and evolves you. Now talk a little bit about you get there and you're starting to compete, you know, on a senior circuit. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about sort of what the training process was physically, but also mentally. And you just said earlier, you said there was a lot of mental prep and there was resources with that. So kind of, your sport is so technical. It's based on precision, right? There's a lot that goes into it physically and mentally. So talk about that training process at that level for you.
Well, I think the first part of it was really just experience, like getting out there and having to, exposure. Like that's the biggest thing. I think when you're young is exposure and experience, because yes, you can mental prep a lot for diving, but you can mental prep much easier after you've experienced a certain level on the international circuit. If you don't really have a basis of like what to go off and how to, like for me, I visualize and I really put myself in the moment when I'm trying to mental prep and prepare myself. But that visualization comes from past feelings, past experiences with, how my heart rate is, how the environment feels, how my body feels in that moment. So there was a lot of work done with my mental prep when I first moved here, which it was hard because I find with mental preps and even some psychologists, it's like you really have to have a connection. And for me, at that point in my life, I didn't really have that connection with like anybody in that kind of field. And I think it's a two-way street. Kind of when you work with a team, you need to, learn how to build not necessarily a relationship, but a certain level of trust and comfort. So for me, it was hard when I was young because one, I didn't really enjoy that part of it. Like now I somewhat enjoy meeting with my psychologist enough that I actually like applied into psychology in university, because I was like, okay, I actually like enjoy this now. But at that age, it wasn't very easy for me to communicate with the mental prep. So eventually kind of started weaning off of it and really just worked on myself in the moment. When I was competing, I would really take it in. But immediately after the competition, I would go over it in my head. I was like, okay, what happened? If it was good or if it was bad. And I would kind of relive it and kind of, integrate that feeling into my head and really burn it into my brain of like what it felt like, why this happened, how it felt, and what I could have done to improve it, or why it went well. So like there's a lot like on the mental aspect, and it's very different for every athlete, especially within diving, because it's such an individual experience. We can do the exact same dive and look pretty much the same, but feel completely different things in the air. So for me, it was really just experience and, pushing through like the hard moments. But the other part of preparation was the physical preparation. I mean, like we used to train Monday to Saturday, but now we just train Monday to Friday because it's really nice to have the weekends off and really be able to recuperate. But Monday to Friday, we started around 9, ended around 4:30 or 5. So pretty long days. Tuesday, Thursday is a little easier, but we incorporate a lot of dry land, visualization, strength training, and then, about a third of it is in the water. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes as well.
And that's important. I appreciate the way you're talking about, because it's not just about getting multiple dives in and multiple reps in, right? There's a whole process that goes in with doing work in the water, out of the water, mentally, physically, psychologically. I mean, all those things. I also love this idea of kind of putting yourself in experience where you may not have it all figured out, and then using that as something that you can evaluate. And so many athletes, I think, go back and they technically evaluate what they did wrong, but you're talking about really breaking it down in terms of what you did well, what you could improve on, and also how it felt like, all of those other things. So it's not just about kind of what we see or the technical aspect, which is theoretically what you're scored on. At least that's what we think when we're watching at home. But you're really kind of breaking it down and really, looking at it from a technical aspect, a psychological aspect, an emotional aspect. And that allows you then to create a framework to continue to learn and grow. And I think that's an important concept, is that, it's not about getting a perfect score, not a perfect score necessarily. It's about what can you learn from these experiences, and each one builds into the next thing. Now, speaking of amazing experiences, so in 2021, you participated in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and you placed fourth, but you also had a career-threatening injury. So I wanted you to talk about sort of the mindset associated with preparing for the Olympics, right? Which is such a high-level event that doesn't come around that often. Navigating the injury kind of while also putting yourself in a position to really, get on that podium.
Yeah, so what happened was literally like my worst nightmare. Like the whole time I had been in Montreal preparing for the Olympics, it was all about avoiding injury. And like even if a little injury came up for me, it felt like the end of the world. So luckily for me, in 2021, I qualified in the synchronized event for the Olympics with my partner. So we officially had that spot already, but I still had to qualify for the individual event, which was to be competed at the Olympic trials in June of 2021. So at that Olympic trials, there was one spot to fight for. I was like the most prepared I'd ever been in my life. Like I was on my game. And a day or two before my event, I was doing a routine jump and my foot got stuck in the mat and I tore 4 ligaments in my left ankle, bone bruise, major bone bruise in my ankle, and I tore a tendon. So it was a pretty severe grade 3 sprain, and the surgeons told me to cancel my flight to the Olympics because they were like, there's like, you can't push through this kind of pain. Like, there's no way. So I asked them, I said, well, is it going to make it worse? And they're like, well, no, it can't really get much worse. You're just not going to have any lateral stability or any stability whatsoever in your foot. And I'm like, okay, well, can I tape it? And they're like, yeah, but it's going to hurt a lot. Like they couldn't comprehend that I was asking these questions. So it's like, okay, well, as long as my bones are broken and I can actually stand on my foot with tape, then I'm going to go. So, we immobilized my foot for 10 days. And then on the 10th day, I got back into the pool and started doing like light stuff. Obviously, like I couldn't quite weight bear at that point, but I was visualizing every single day. I showed up to the pool. My whole team was actually still in Toronto. They went back to Toronto for the pre-Olympic training camp, and I had to stay back in Montreal by myself with my physio, and we worked 5 hours a day on my foot. Whether it was around 2.5-ish hours of like physio rehab, trying to get rid of the swelling and all of that. And then the rest of it was trying to like strengthen and go through movements that I was used to, like, you know, muscle memory kind of movements that even if I wasn't jumping or doing the dives, I could reintegrate it into my daily routine to just like keep my brain stimulated, keep my body doing those movements, and, you know, keep it a little bit more fresh in my mind, because I knew it was going to be a while for me before I did actually my harder dives. And at this point, my injury, it happened exactly a month before my event at the Olympics was to happen. So 4 weeks is not a lot of time when it comes to an injury like that. And I did end up starting to dive around 14, 15 days later, jumping, which was incredibly painful and a huge struggle, but I was really motivated, and that motivation I found brought a lot of adrenaline. So like that helped me a lot when I was diving, and just that motivation, like, I'm not going to let this slide. Like, I've been working my whole life for this moment, and I'm not going to let my ankle hurting get in the way of me going to the Olympics, because, you know, I had also worked so hard with my synchro partner, and she had put so much work in for the past 5 years that there was a part of me that didn't want to let her down and let her go through the experience without me. Like, she was a veteran at that point, and this was going to be her last Olympics. So I didn't want, you know, that to go. But also, like, my husband had qualified for the Olympics, so I wanted to go to the Olympics with my husband. So it's like there's a lot of factors that really motivated me. And also the fact that I moved away at 16 and I missed my brothers growing up, and my family didn't get to see me. And, you know, there's all those things that were like, okay, I'm going to go to the Olympics. So I got to the Olympics. I actually, before the Olympics, I went to the pool when I wasn't diving, and I would sit on the 10-meter and I would visualize, and I would, you know, stand up there. And I posted a video on my Instagram before I went to the Olympics of me doing simulations. So I do like a standing simulation of all the little important movements in my dives, which when I do them, I can feel them. Like, I've worked on visualization enough that like I can really feel my dives and I can feel the movements. So I would go up there every day and do my 5 dives in my head and be on the 10-meter, and that helped me a lot in the end. And I had a lot of people support me. Like, I reached out to one of the Olympic champions from the States, David Badaya, and he kind of walked me through like what he had done in a situation that was similar, and that was very motivating for me. Like, being able to talk to one of my biggest idols, like, I'm still starstruck when I talk to him. Like, it's just like, I'm like, oh my God, like, you're talking to me. Okay. You're giving me advice. That's so awesome. So like, that was very helpful. And I had a really supportive atmosphere and environment, but it was definitely a traumatic experience. Like, I'm still dealing with it now. Like, I just got surgery 3 months ago on my ankle. So it's all fixed up, which is nice. Like, I have ligaments now. And I have a stable ankle, but I'm still struggling like with the trauma and the trusting my body and being able to train, and kind of getting coaches to understand, you know, this is my path, but I need to be smart and I need to be safe. And just because I pushed through that amount of pain at the Olympics doesn't necessarily mean that I can push through it every single day of my life. Because I was able to push through that pain because I knew it was only a month. Like, I knew after that event, I knew I was like, Kate, I don't ever have to do this again. So.
No, I appreciate that. Has anybody, you've talked about visualization a lot and the role that it plays in your training process and even how you used it when you couldn't physically train. Has anybody explained to you specifically how visualization works in terms of why it's so effective?
No.
Let me explain it to you, because I think it's such a cool concept. And it's interesting because I think in certain sports, gymnastics, diving, some of those individual type sports, a lot of athletes really integrate it and they use it and they find that it's helpful. But it's interesting because they don't seldom understand truly what's happening. So here's what's happening, right? When you do a physical movement over and over and over again, what ends up happening is that muscle gets engaged. It's innervated by nerves. That nerve sends a signal that goes to your spinal cord and then up to your brain. And you just said it, it's muscle memory. So that's why we do things over and over and over again, right? And the more you do it, the more your brain knows what to do. So it's like, okay, we're going to do this dive, or we're going to do this movement. You know exactly what to do and what muscles to engage because you've trained it physically over and over again. So you've sent that signal up. With visualization, what ends up happening is when you visualize, that same part of your brain gets activated, Caeli, the same part of your brain. And so now what happens is it sends a signal down to the muscle. And so your muscles are actually getting the signal. And so you are training them. That's why you can feel it. That's why you can, and the more you do it, the more you're sending that signal down. And the more you send a signal down, the sharper that connection gets, right? The faster it gets, right? It's like upgrading your internet signal, right? And so what ends up happening is then when you want to do it and you see it, you end up seeing it much more clearly, and the signal ends up being that much sharper. And so your muscles get that information of what they need in what order to fire, how strongly to fire. And so even those smaller muscle movements get engaged. And so, the problem with physically training is it's time limited. If you get injured, you're not able to do it. If you get sick, there's all these limitations to training physically. But, and I tell athletes all this time, this, in your case, I would say, look, the diving board and the pool in your head is always open. It's always the temperature you want it to be. It's always playing whatever music you want it to be. Like, it's always the way you want it. So you can really take the time and get those reps in. But what you're actually doing is you're tying together that connection between in your brain and your body. And so you can end up making up for a lot of time that you're not able to do physically. And so it's something that I think all athletes should do, even when they're not injured. But I think that the fact that you had already implemented into your practice and it was already something that you were doing also then gives you something to focus on when you can't do certain things. And so there's a comfort level with that, right? Because I can't do this, but I know I can do this. So let me invest in that. The other important thing is you talked about how you would get up there and you would really visualize the different steps, right? And that's important. I think a lot of times when we think of visualization, we visualize like an end product. Like you dive into the pool, it's a perfect score. There's no splash. Everybody's cheering, Canadian flags are everywhere. Like it's an amazing experience. But the reality is, in order to have a perfect dive, you have to do things in particular steps. And when we visualize in steps, then we're really able to like hone us in on those little microscopic pieces that are so integral to the overall performance. But oftentimes it's harder to do that physically. So mentally, it also helps sharpen that. And so that confidence and that growth can come with that. So that's, in a nutshell, what's happening, within the brain and within the body. And it's something that I find that once athletes understand that, it even empowers them, motivates them even more, because they're like, wait, so I'm like, this is actually working. Like, I know it works, but like, I kind of trust that it works now. It's like, wait, that's an actual connection that I'm investing in and putting time in. And so again, the sharper that connection between the two and the more direct it is, the better it's going to be. And the more you trust it because you've seen it over and over again. And that's what's happening within the brain. It's a pretty cool process.
Very, very cool. Like I do visualization every day now. Since I'm still 3 months post-op. So I'm like taking it a little bit slower and, getting back into the pool slowly, but I'm not doing my hard dives. So every day I'm still doing my visualization. So it's pretty cool to like understand what's going on when I'm doing it. And like my coach is like yelling at me, like, focus, you're in your dive. And I'm like, okay, really try and like close my wall. So it's cool to understand that whole process.
And the other thing you can do too is you can break down your rehab process into visualization. So in addition to visualizing your dives, like your rehab exercises, that you can only do so much, right? Because, you have to rest. You can actually break that down into steps. And so if you're doing like foot movements or you're doing certain things, you can break that down into steps and then visualize each step. And again, you're sending signals, you're activating those muscles, right, on a smaller level. And so you're building strength. And the more you send a signal down, you activate those muscles, blood flow goes to those muscles. So that can also help accelerate your recovery, which a lot of athletes don't understand because, again, when they're injured, they focus on what they can't do and they might be visualizing sort of the actions. But even the rehab process, there's a lot of studies that show significant acceleration and progress within that process. So think about that too and kind of build that in. And it's something that, again, you're used to doing it. So I think it would lend itself pretty well.
Mhm.
Um, let me talk about this with you because, and you sort of really touched upon it just now, and I could see that you got emotional about sort of the struggle, and you used the word trauma, and you said you're still kind of navigating this. And I think that as athletes, so much as attention is placed on physical health, right? And so much of success and navigating success is related, in my opinion, to mental health, right? And mentally how we approach going into, a big competition like the Olympics, mentally how we approach what we're doing when we're 10 meters up above, and we have to figure out, mentally how we navigate sort of that transition out of the Olympics. And I know you've talked a little bit about that challenge. Um, so can you talk a little bit about your personal experiences with mental health, and even like eating stuff and sort of, again, how that's impacted you?
Yeah, so I mean, since I was a teenager, I remember having anxiety, and it mostly started out of school. So I noticed it mostly when I was at school. I would have panic attacks going to school. Every time I had to do a presentation, like it wasn't just like, the nervous jitters, it was a full-on panic attack where I couldn't show up to school. So when I was younger, I didn't really have support or help. Like it wasn't really something we addressed. It was kind of just like, okay, suck it up and like get through it. When I moved to Montreal, however, it was much more prominent because I felt quite alone, and I didn't want to be a burden on all the new people in my life. So my anxiety has always been there. And it was something that I mostly just talked about with my doctor. So I managed to, kind of regulate my anxiety, and, I did go through bouts of depression, and for me it was kind of like, oh, this is normal, like this is what it's supposed to be like as a high level athlete. I thought this is what you have to go through to, get to that level. And so I didn't really talk about it to many of my friends, but they would see me having panic attacks at the pool and be like, okay, like what's going on, like stop, suck it up. um but then at a certain point I realized, okay, like not everybody deals with this. Like there's like, the lucky few that don't deal with anxiety to that level or that extent. But I now understand that everybody kind of has like a brush with anxiety at some point in their lives, which if we don't talk about it, it's kind of hard to, conceptualize like the actual concept of anxiety being something that we all have had at a certain point. But with that anxiety, and the pressure, for me, I felt a lot of pressure. I felt a lot of pressure to kind of step up to the plate and, in a sense, fill some shoes of, Olympic medalists, when I moved here, because my synchro partner's ex synchro partner, they got 2 Olympic medals together. So for me being the new girl, it was like, okay, you got to step up. You got to be at this level, when it's like, how do you expect me to be at this level when I've never even been at like level 5, like you got to go through the steps. But for me, it was just like all in right away. So with that came a lot of body dysmorphia. Like I had a lot of issues with my body image, especially being on TV, like going from, just being on the computer to being on TV quite regularly. And I remember being at Pan Am Games in 2019, and this is when like my eating disorder really kind of blew up. And I always kind of avoided food when I felt, bigger, and, like that, just like a very unhealthy relationship with food. But after Pan Am Games, I got very sick the day before my event. So like I couldn't eat anything. I was vomiting before my event, and then the only reason I was able to get through my event was because of the adrenaline again. I managed to get second in that competition, which was like the best result I'd ever gotten, with no food in my system. And I was like, oh wow, okay, crazy. And then I got back to the village after that event, and I had another competition the next day. I like literally was sick all night, slept until 1 p.m. in the afternoon, competed at 8 p.m. at night, and we won. I didn't eat anything for those like 2 days, and I could barely eat anything for the next maybe 2 or 3. And I got home and I had lost like 9 pounds. And I was like, wow, this is the most successful week of my life. And I get home and everyone's like, wow, you look so fit. You look so good. Just that feedback was like you said at the beginning of the podcast, those little things that just get integrated into your brain, and they're just burnt there, and it's almost like a positive feedback for a negative action. And for me it was like yeah, I had thrown up all week, not intentionally, but like the outcome of that was like, wow, I look this like the thinnest, and like you can see my muscles, you can see my abs. I can wear a bikini and I look skinny. Like I feel good about how my body looks. And it was a very, I didn't notice it at the time, but after talking to my nutritionist and stuff at a certain point, I realized that. But so after that, I went online and watched my videos of me diving, and I could see within 2 weeks I had world championships and I had Pan Am Games. World championships was my first individual competition where I was like really, really by myself on the platform. And I could see my body and I was like, oh, I don't like that. I looked at Pan Am Games and I was like, oh, okay, I can deal with that. So from there, my eating disorder kind of like just really grew, and I didn't really have much support. I didn't really accept that I had an eating disorder until about a year in. And like when it was really bad, and talking to my nutritionist, and she's like, okay, well, first of all, we're just going to have to address this. And she's like, you have an eating disorder. And I just broke down. I was like, no, I don't. Fine. She's like, you have an eating disorder. And we realized that, well, we have accepted, not realized, that I have bulimia. And it was something that I had been kind of hiding from everybody. And I thought it was just me being, nervous after, eating my lunch. I would eat it for a little bit in front of people, and then I'd go vomit before practice. And it just kind of became a habit. And it was something that really just, it wasn't a comfort thing, but it was, because if I was uncomfortable after eating, I'd feel more comfortable if I had vomited and I was empty at practice. So there was like it was a very hard path to go on. But once I started seeing a psychologist about, helping me with my eating disorder, and once I opened up to my husband about what I was struggling with, like I would come home, have dinner, and I would be able to hide it from him, that I was vomiting after eating. He had no idea. And so when I told him, I actually didn't tell him. I was like, my nutritionist had to go up to him and talk to him. And like, I was like, I can't tell him, you need to tell him, like, you need to do this. So she went and talked to him and kind of told him, what's going on and what he could maybe do to help. And that I just felt like a burden, and I didn't want to be a burden, but having support would be helpful. So I built a really strong group around me of people that could understand. And I'm very lucky to have a best friend. Unfortunately, she has an eating disorder as well, a different kind of eating disorder, but we both understand that concept. And she's a very high level athlete as well. So like, we know what it's like to be on TV. We know what it's like to have the body dysmorphia when you see yourself and you're like, oh my God, I hate that. Or I love that. And it's an unhealthy thing. So it's having that kind of surrounding of people that understand and that can help you, and that kind of know how to navigate oh, she's looking really thin. It's maybe not the best time to say you look great right now, because so I've been trying to advocate and kind of educate, especially the coaches at the pool, because they've never really had an athlete that's open about their experience with eating disorders. And I've been, trying to at least help them understand, certain situations. Because when I opened up about my eating disorder to my coach, it was kind of like, I don't want to know. Like, I don't want to know. I don't need to know. That's too much personal information. I'm like, no, you do need to know, because I need someone when I'm at competitions. If I'm sitting at the table and I'm not eating, I need you to be like, KK, you have a big competition. Let's try and find something you're comfortable with, rather than like just completely ignore it, or, or on a day where like they're not really thinking, say something that kind of makes me feel like, oh, I'm fat today. Like there's comments that come out that they don't mean to make it, a huge thing, but in an eating disorder brain, it's exacerbated to like the biggest thing. So I was very direct, and I pushed it a lot for them to understand what I was going through. And I didn't share much detail, but I was like, I'm struggling. And when I'm struggling, I'm going to tell you, and we're going to have to find a way to navigate it. So my whole goal over the past like 2 years has been to build a relationship with my team, so that they can understand me and I can understand them, and we can work together, even if we're uncomfortable, but like it's the reality. And like being inside this, like I have so many friends in gymnastics and, swimming and a whole loads of sports. And it's crazy how many people experience really similar things to what I'm experiencing. And when I open up on Instagram, I get so many messages like, thank you for sharing. Like, I'm not ready to share my story yet, but it's really nice to see someone that is going through it as well. And I'm like, wow, okay, we really need to expand on like maybe not expressing everyone's individual stories because it's sometimes it's traumatic and they don't want to share it and can feel embarrassing as well. But just knowing that you're not alone in that is insane. Like it's insanely helpful. And that's why my best friend having an eating disorder, which I always say like it's awesome because like we can understand each other, but it sucks as well because we're both going through very hard things. But being able to call her up and be like, hey, I'm struggling today. Do you want to like eat with me? But in a controlled way. Or like if I know I'm gonna have a binge, she's like, okay, I'll come and we'll like have a controlled binge. Like you can have what you want, but we're gonna be in a controlled way. So that's how I've kind of like dealt with it. But it's like I've said it before, it's like once you have an eating disorder, it never goes away. You just learn how to cope with it and you know how to deal with it and you know how to, navigate it and make it less prominent in your life. But there's always going to be things that kind of pop up that, bring that eating disorder brain kind of up to the forefront.
This is so, first of all, it's so important what you're saying. And the way you're saying it is important. So we talked about sort of how our brains process experiences, but I think the other important thing that you're really highlighting is the language we use and what we say is so critical. And I think this is part of the problem with mental health and mental health awareness and quote unquote breaking the stigma is that we sort of don't know what to say or how to say it. And a lot of folks are very uncomfortable talking about it. So you even talked about like your coach saying, I don't need to know this. I don't want to know about it. And I think the reality is some of these things are very, very uncomfortable to talk about, and particularly if you don't even know what to say or how to say it. And it's interesting because throughout this whole conversation, as you explained all this, you were very intentional about what you say. And you even, I don't know if you noticed this, you corrected what you said with your therapist. You said, that you all were talking about it one way and you said, nope, this is actually how we need to talk about it or how we understand it. So even understanding the language we use to explain it to ourselves is so incredibly important. And to label things as they are in the idea then of working towards then how do we work with this and how do we navigate this? And I think that's such an incredibly important point is that, validating these experiences has a lot of value, but also like what we say and how we say it can again be incredibly important and make those steps towards recovery. I also love how you said it never goes away. You learn how to navigate it, right? And deal with it. And so again, that's this idea of once you sort of understand the role that these things play and what we call them and what we call the recovery process, to a large extent, it empowers you to be able to say, okay, now what can I do? And how can I understand this, right? Because you're not trying to sort of cure something that's incurable, or you're not trying to fix something that's quote unquote broken, because these are part of the human experiences and they're shaped through our lives, right? You talked about anxiety and always having anxiety. I talk about how anxiety is an interesting thing because a lot of high level performing athletes have it. It's what drives us to be motivated. It's what drives us to be very particular. In your sport, it's very much about like where you stand and how you stand and what you do and how you bend your, I mean, everything has to go down to a level of detail, and there's anxiety that comes with that. And so inevitably it's a fine line of when it promotes you to be very successful and it kind of gets in your way. But with anxiety, and that really high level of attention to certain things and feeling things strongly can also then lead to other things like eating disorders. And these things are inevitably ingrained, which is why when I talked about mental health, I asked about eating disorders and the concept of that, because to me, they're very much closely linked. I love that you said my goal is to really build relationships with my team, my coaches, and stuff like that. And I know that you're now a big advocate based on your personal experiences, based on kind of your whole process. So what do you do now kind of on a daily basis or consistent basis to take care of yourself physically and mentally?
Well, with my eating disorder, it's a very big thing for me to try and feed my body properly. I'm still in that constant fight of like, it's hard for me to be completely nourished every day, which is, it's a hard thing to accept, but like, I'm really trying to, make a structure of eating and a schedule and a routine that I stick to that's healthy and manageable mentally and physically for me. Also surrounding myself with good people. I've worked really hard on surrounding myself with people that support me. So that has been like a really big thing in my life that I've noticed a huge change where I can live day to day and have a good group of friends that kind of they understand me, and I feel comfortable saying no, or I feel comfortable really, doing my own thing. And like, if I don't want to go for dinner, or if I don't want to go to their house, or if I don't want to do something, I can say no and I don't feel guilty about it. Um, Another thing is like, I found the past 2 years I haven't done school. I was just focusing mainly on diving, and it was a lot of pressure on me, just because I didn't feel like I had any identity outside of diving. So I started doing school again this year, and it's been helping me a lot. Just feel like I have, other vessels in my life to really work on and succeed in. And with that school, I've found also like that just in my life, like I just enjoy going outside. I enjoy going for walks. I enjoy with things that like I didn't otherwise want to do, because like with diving, I trained so hard that it's like, okay, no, I'm tired. Like, leave me alone. I don't want to go walking. I don't want to go like do anything that I have to use energy. But now I'm like, oh, okay, like there's a lot more to life than just like waking up, going to the pool, working out, sweating, crying maybe a bit, and then coming home, like, so that those are, all things that I've really kind of been working on. And also now, like, I didn't really mention this much before, but I mentioned that my husband was a diver. And well, we've been together almost 6 years now. So for 5 years, we had, woken up together, gone to the pool together, had lunch, trained again, come home, have dinner, go to bed, and repeat. So for 5 years, that was my life. And now he's retired. So I've been working really hard on, keeping a relationship with him that's like, it's different now. Like, we don't spend our days together. So there's like a whole new aspect of my life where like, oh wow, we have to like really like try and like find time for each other and like appreciate the moments that we have together. So there's a lot of new kind of, areas of my life that I've been working on, and it is really new. So I'm still learning how to work on them, but I would say like the biggest part of my life right now that I need to work on is the healthy eating and the consistent, routine, and understanding that what's going in my body isn't the worst thing in the world. It's not, it's not a bad thing to feed yourself. And so, yeah.
I mean, so it sounds like what you're doing is you're kind of redefining your relationship with your health. You're redefining your relationship with yourself. You're redefining kind of your relationship with your friends and your social group, the activities you want to do, and even redefining your relationship with your husband and what that looks like. And all of that, I think, is going to ultimately allow you to redefine your relationship with your sport and the role that it plays as part of your life, but not sort of all encompassing. Caeli, this has been incredible. Anything else that you want to add before we end?
Just thank you for having me. It's been, awesome to talk about it, and I'm very happy to share my story, and I hope that it can inspire or comfort some people if they're struggling, to either open up about their experiences, and just know that things are easier when you can talk about it to somebody, and it will get better.
Where can people learn about you?
I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Instagram, my name is at Caeli McKay. It's at CaeMcKay. And from there, you can kind of find everything.
Caeli, I really appreciate it. This has been an incredible conversation. I look forward to having many more conversations with you. It's cool to kind of hear your story and even kind of like highlight certain things that you're doing and have been doing, but didn't necessarily kind of tie together how that all works. So that's always fun for me. I hope everybody else enjoyed this as much as I did. If you did, please consider leaving me a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. If you don't have access, please email me your thoughts, mindsettraininginstitute@gmail.com. To learn more about me and my work, mindsettraininginstitute.com. I'm also on Instagram at Dr. T_sportspsych, SPORTS PSYCH. You will definitely not see me diving off any boards for sure, but I do a lot of other stuff. And I want to thank Caeli. I want to thank everybody who supports this show. And remember, think great, feel great, be great. Mindset is everything.